This presentation is titled Like Birds and Beasts, Justifying Violence Against Catholics in the Late Joseon Dynasty, Korea, and I gave it at the annual meeting of the AAS in 2011, which was held in beautiful Hawaii. In 1839, Magdalene Kim Obi, a widow aged 66, was tortured and beheaded for practicing Catholicism. How was the Chosun state able to justify such violence against a seemingly harmless old woman, in fact a widow, just the kind of person that the Chosun state was supposed to defend? In order to try and answer this question, I'm going to look at the public proclamations the Chosun state issued on Catholicism in 1801, 1839, and 1866. And in the process of answering this question, we'll also see how the government used persecution to rhetorically strengthen its rule, and see what categories the Korean elite saw as important in terms of identity. Catholics began to appear in Korea in 1784, and this led to very quickly to persecution against them, but it was very limited. There were not very large-scale persecutions, and very few people were actually killed. And in part, this was because of factional issues. Basically, King Jongjo relied on the Southerner faction to help maintain his power against the Old Doctrine faction. And most of the elite Catholics were associated with the Southerner faction, so a major persecution basically would have hurt his own power base, so King Jongjo wasn't interested in allowing that. Well, King Jongjo, though, died in the year 1800, and his son, Sunjo, still a young boy, ascended to the throne, and he had a regent named Queen Chongsun, and she was no friend of the Southerners, and she decided to ally with the Old Doctrine faction, and this then opened the way for a large-scale persecution. And so, in the first month of 1801, in accordance with the lunar calendar, a persecution edict was issued. And in it, it stressed that the earlier policy of King Jongjo had failed to contain the Catholic threat. Catholicism was spreading like a raging fire. Catholicism caused human beings to degenerate into birds and beasts, and so threatened to destroy the Confucian civilization that the state was supposed to protect. So officials were told that they were supposed to admonish the people to give up the practice of Catholicism, and if people didn't give up, if Catholics didn't apostatize, they were to be treated as rebels. And what's particularly striking to me about this edict is it doesn't really say too much particularly Catholic about these Catholics. You wouldn't even realize that they were Catholics if you didn't know the historical context, and except for a few lines at the very end of the persecution that identify it as being a religion coming from the West. So not all that Catholic. Now, the initial focus of the persecution was on the factional enemies, particularly the Southerners who were connected to Catholicism, but it didn't stop with them. It also targeted commoners and women, so we can say that this wasn't simply an issue of factionalism. And the persecution continued throughout 1801, killed a couple hundred people, and by late 1801 the government decided it was safe enough to end the active phase of the persecution. So then, in the 12th month of 1801, this proclamation ending the persecution was issued. This proclamation began by emphasizing the Chosun state's Confucian identity and success at implementing true civilization on the peninsula. It also stressed the dynastic state's connection to the great cultural heroes of East Asia, such as the sage emperors Yao and Shun, and the founders of Neo-Confucianism. After asserting the state's Neo-Confucian identity, it began to talk about the Catholics, and it said the Catholics, because of their immorality, endangered this Neo-Confucian civilization and the proper morality it taught. Catholic books were said to delude the world and deceive the people, and so threatened to destroy the 5 relationships and 3 bonds. Moreover, the religious beliefs of Catholics made them somehow other than human. So, for example, it was said that it is human nature to love life and hate death, but these Catholics treat the implements of execution as a comfortable place to sleep. And basically what this is saying is the Catholic zeal for martyrdom, this desire for death, and makes them somehow other than human. Now, despite the inclusion of Catholic distinctives, for example, the proclamation mentions priests, bishops, and the 10 Commandments, they're just mentioned in passing, and very little understanding is actually shown of Catholicism as a religion. And for the most part, the criticism focuses more on the idea of Catholicism as a source of rebellion, with insincere Catholic leaders, people who really don't seem to believe in Catholicism so much, using the religion to trick the common people into joining it, so that then they can use that as kind of a nucleus for rebellion. So then the edict has clearly identified Catholics as people who are dangerous, who need to be dealt with. And it also went on to justify violence in other ways. It was stressed that Catholics were ultimately at fault for their treatment. After all, they hadn't responded to Zhengzhou's policy of limited persecution, his more gentle approach. So now it was necessary to be harsher with them. And in fact, the state was absolved of any guilt because it only treated Catholics, it only treated people according to the evil in their hearts, right? You yourself, based on how evil you were, determined what kind of violence you suffered. And while the proclamation admitted that there was kind of a problem with killing women and young people, that it was emphasized that the danger that they posed, even these women and young people, was so great that it was necessary to do so. And in a large part, the executions of people like this were necessary because they could spread this error around to other people. What is especially striking in this edict is the use of animal imagery. For example, Father James Jo Wen Mo, a Chinese priest serving in Korea, was described as an insect who had snuck into the country in someone's sleeve. Huang Sayung, an important early Catholic leader, was said to have a wolf's heart and a fox's face. The Catholic god was described as a snake god and an ox spirit. Similarly, there was an interesting quote that stated that during the time of 3 dynasties, since everyone knew at least a little about the principle of human relationships, they understood the difference between a dog and a person. So Catholics are people who, things have basically degenerated in that now we have these people who can't tell the difference between a dog and a person, so they act in this way. And in the old days, it would have been enough just to burn Catholic books or throw them in a pond or something. To destroy them would have been enough, and people would have left the faith. But now things have just become so degenerate that we actually have to execute people. But what's important is that for the most part, this use of animal imagery focused on individuals, not so much Catholics as a category. The proclamation ended by praising the king in the highest of terms for his defeat of the Catholic menace, and stressed that the state had succeeded in protecting true civilization against this Catholic threat, therefore justifying the state. It was doing a good job, it was protecting civilization like it was supposed to. And the edict also called on the people of the Chosun to return to the fundamentals of Confucian morality by fulfilling the proper roles, or the roles proper to their social status. Moreover, it was also stressed that though the active persecution was ending, it was still a crime to be a Catholic, and that people who continued to hold the religion would be executed. The 1839 persecution had a similar beginning in the sense that it happened under a king that was still a minor. King Hongjong was still was still a boy who was under the regency of a queen, dowager. However, it was not marked by the action of traditional political factions. Moreover, there was no edict actually beginning it, only one ending, and this seems to be in part because the 1801 edict ending the persecution made it clear that basically this was still to be Catholic was still a capital crime. It was just ending active persecution. So in this edict, like the previous one, so that we only have this edict ending the persecution. There's no edict beginning it. And this edict ending it began similar to 1801 and it exalted Chosun's historical identity as a Neo-Confucian state, which taught its subjects the right way. It used the suppression of Catholicism as an opportunity to call on people to return to the fundamentals of Confucianism. And while the state would attempt to reform Catholics, it was ultimately those who chose. It was ultimately their choice to determine how they were punished, and if they decided to maintain their faith, it would be their own fault that they would be punished. Further justifications were added. For example, Catholics were compared to religious rebels from China, such as the Buddhist-inspired White Lotus and Taoist-inspired Yellow Turbans. Moreover, 1801, the persecution of 1801 was used as a precedent. After all, the state, their ancestors, right, the previous generation had persecuted Catholicism in 1801, so it was therefore justified to do it again, and in fact it was kind of a duty. Moreover, in this persecution there were actually 3 missionaries that were executed, and this actual presence of Westerners was stated as one reason why things were worse than in 1801, so persecution was called for then, how much more now? The thing is, what's curious, they didn't really do much with this actual presence of Westerners. They didn't really expand on this in the edict. It just pretty much stayed at that level.